You're listening to Eating for Eden, episode 33. When it comes to doing something about climate change, your food choices matter. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden, a podcast that takes a food-first approach to climate action. I'm your host, Jessica J. Schroeder, and I am passionate about food that tastes good and does good. I'll guide you with practical tips and help you thoroughly enjoy your food along the way. Last week, we talked about the general concept of loving one's global neighbor through engaging in climate action. To recap, the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change are typically those who have done the least to cause it. And conversely, those of us who have done the most to cause it are less likely to experience drastic effects as soon and may be able to escape some of the worst of it due to our locations and/or financial means. Next week, we'll talk a bit more about the responsibility that comes with means. But today, I'd like to focus on how climate change affects food. Much of what we discuss here on Eating for Eden has to do with the impact our food choices have on the environment. But our food, as part of the environment, is affected by our choices as well, because climate change has impacts on what is able to grow, where, how well, and so on. Today we'll explore how the environmental impacts that are coming, and indeed are already happening, may affect the foods that we rely on to feed the world. As a quick aside, when I say the environmental impacts that are coming, I mean that there are indeed greater negative consequences coming. That much is clear. Even if we jump on this issue in earnest and make big strides to reduce global emissions over the next 5, 10, and 20 years, we have already done a significant amount of damage to Earth's delicate balance. We're already seeing unprecedented numbers of so-called 100-year floods. They're so frequent, we might need to consider renaming them. We're seeing hurricanes and other storms continue to grow in their intensity and frequency. Warming temperatures are causing continued melting of ice caps and subsequent sea level rise. Shortening winters are enabling insects to devour forests of critical carbon-storing trees. You get the picture. I could go on. Additionally, if you're new to the various ways that climate change has already been ravaging the world, including affluent countries such as the United States, I suggest checking out the 2014 docu-series called Years of Living Dangerously, available to watch for free on YouTube. Also check out the documentary film Paris to Pittsburgh on Disney+. Both are linked in the show notes. If you're still on the fence about what you think about climate change, I hope such resources can help to show you that the science isn't ambivalent, nor are the lived experiences of numerous millions around the globe. Well, back to the topic at hand. The concern of climate change doesn't just inform how what those of us in more affluent countries or circumstances choose to eat, as far as our own emissions footprint is concerned. There is also evidence the food we grow globally will be affected by climate change, and it already is being affected. Not only do rising sea levels and increasing numbers and magnitudes of severe weather events currently threaten crops, but even the crops that do make it to harvest will likely have lower levels of nutrients. For wealthy nations whose populations often suffer more from overnutrition than undernutrition, why is this such a big deal? Well, part of it comes back to what we discussed last week. Our actions are not merely for ourselves. Climate change indeed affects us all, but it affects the poor first and worst. Rather than seeking to take action that only benefits us, we ought to consider how we love our global neighbor. Additionally, most wealthy nations still import many of their food commodities. The potential of both lower crop yields and less nutrition in the yields that make it to distribution won't pass us by. It will affect us. It's only a matter of time. But bear in mind that it will affect our vulnerable global neighbor even worse. And they're already the ones at risk of malnutrition. We can lump the impacts of climate change on food into two main buckets: indirect and direct impacts. Indirect impacts include things like floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, and intense storms such as hurricanes, all of which could reduce overall crop yields, destroy significant portions of crops, or otherwise limit transportation and thus distribution of food to those who need it. This can be summarized as two essential parts of the food system: food availability and food access. Food availability has to do with how much food is produced, and thus how much is available to be distributed across various populations. Food access has to do with any given individual's or community's access to that food for consumption. Distinguishing these helps us to see that even where there is food available, there could be issues with food access. Conversely, even though a population typically has access to particular foods, if there is not enough available, then that access will be impeded. Okay, that's indirect impacts in a nutshell. Direct impacts include the changing environment's impact on food's nutritional quality. In other words, the changing growing conditions can negatively impact the resulting fruit of the harvest due to a changing climate. For instance, when grown under conditions with higher levels of CO2, common staple crops are less nutritious. Two recent studies estimated the impact of anticipated levels of atmospheric CO2 on staple crops, looking at resulting protein and zinc levels, respectively. Both of these papers are open access, so you can see them without paying, and I've linked them in the show notes if you'd like to view them for yourself. Summarized results from the protein research by Medak and colleagues stated that under elevated atmospheric CO2 concentrations, rice, wheat, barley, and potato protein contents decreased by 7.6%, 7.8%, 14.1%, and 6.4% respectively. These numbers may not seem like much, but they can be the difference between nutritional adequacy and inadequacy for many around the globe. Those who rely on such staple crops to make up significant portions of their diet, and many who are already at risk of malnutrition, will likely be put at greater risk. The protein research estimates that 18 countries may lose more than 5% of their dietary protein, including India at 5.3%. By 2050, assuming today's diets and levels of income equality, an additional 1.6%, or nearly 150 million of the world's population, may be placed at risk of protein deficiency because of elevated CO2 concentrations. In India, an additional 53 million people may become at risk. Since protein is a macronutrient, and we're pretty good at prioritizing our intake of protein in Western countries such as the United States, it might be a bit easier to resonate with the impact of climate change on protein content in common plant foods. Considering zinc by comparison may seem like less of a concern, but this mineral is critical for health and is especially of concern for the most at risk of malnutrition. According to Myers and colleagues in their 2015 paper published in The Lancet, zinc deficiency is currently responsible for large burdens of disease globally, and the populations who are at highest risk of zinc deficiency also receive most of their dietary zinc from crops. Thus, even modest changes in zinc levels of staple crops could pose a significant health risk to many. To summarize this paper's findings, they estimated zinc bioavailability in various staple crops under both ambient and elevated CO2 conditions, the latter being what is expected to be the CO2 levels in 2050. Based on the estimated bioavailable zinc and country-specific requirements across the globe for zinc requirements, it is estimated that 138 million additional people could be at risk for zinc deficiency by 2050. If you take a look at the map or figure 1 in the study, the distribution of risk is wildly disproportionate, affecting the poorer nations more significantly. As a reminder from last week's episode, those who are poorest, those most at risk of malnourishment, are also those who are likely to be hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather events that could wipe out large portions of a crop in any given area. Even if those of us in wealthier nations are able to find ways to stem the effects of potential shortages, the poorest may not be so fortunate. Both indirect and direct impacts of climate change on food, so its availability, one's access to it, and its nutritional quality, are of great concern on a global scale. As I wrap things up, how do we get practical in light of today's topic? I wouldn't be surprised if you're feeling a bit discouraged in light of all that's been shared, but there are things we can do. We can start with actions that lower emissions in order to limit the effects of climate change on our food systems. While some of these impacts are indeed coming down the pipeline regardless, to do nothing would be to allow them to get worse. We simply cannot stand back and do nothing. In order to mitigate these ill effects, we must act now. I realize this news isn't particularly cheery, but we have to reckon with the facts. Only then can we turn to hopeful action. And the hopeful part is that we do have agency. We can take meaningful action. As I noted last week, there are 3 simple actions with which we can start. 1, eat lower emission foods. 2, be willing to change your habits. And 3, talk about it. And certainly do what you can beyond food too. If you can use solar or wind energy, obtain an electric vehicle, or make other changes to reduce your carbon footprint and rely less on fossil fuels, by all means do so. But here on Eating for Eden, we focus on taking a food-first approach to climate action because it is something each of us listening likely has a choice about several times each day. Don't give up, and certainly don't think your actions are meaningless. You're living in alignment with your values, voting with your dollars, and creating opportunities to invite others to join you. Remember that we're stronger together. Be sure to tune in next week for the 3rd and final episode of this brief series. I look forward to seeing you then, as it were. And if you found today's topic particularly interesting and would like to learn more, I highly recommend listening to Sigma Nutrition Radio episode 446, linked in the show notes. There you'll get a deeper dive into the impact of climate change on our food with over an hour of in-depth discussion of the relevant research, which I only dipped a toe into today. If you have questions or topics you'd like me to address here on Eating for Eden, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to edenandme@substack.com. Also, if you've been enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a review. It's a great help for getting these important words out to others. And if you want recipes, check out edenandme.com, where you can find a variety of delicious, healthy recipes to bring what you're learning into the kitchen. Finally, become an email subscriber on Substack to have new podcast episodes delivered directly to your inbox. If you appreciate the work I'm doing and want to support the show, you'll also have the option of becoming a paid subscriber. That's all for now, friends. Until next time, be well. Thanks for listening to Eating for Eden. If you found this episode informative or inspiring, please consider sharing it with a friend. Climate change is an issue we all need to tackle together, so let's invite others to journey along with us as we continue the conversation and start taking action. Until next week, friends, take care.